old one used to just like go, and when it goes, I just like edit whatever I don't have. So like this is
Okay.
why I typically just click record right away. I don't do
Mhm.
intros because I just go and we record.
Yeah,
So
I
like
noticed that.
this is how I do it because it's like the best way. I think it's the best way to have conversation. Like to
Yeah, it
truly
feels like you're just like walking into a room with people talking. And you're like, oh, I'll just stay for a while.
exactly. See, that's exactly why I create the podcast, and that's the way like my energy is with things. Because Leah and I were chatting about what is kind of like at least like my talent, and I definitely want to dive into this on like another episode at some point. But it's like I can connect with anyone anywhere. Like
It's a
that.
great quality.
It's also why I create the podcast because I know I can get really dope people on here and make like fun conversation and something meaningful out of people and find out like how they became who they were and everything.
Mm.
So it's like because for example, I was at the grocery store. I was just talking to like the counter lady, and somehow we got to knowing about her dogs and like what she does for her life. Like, and I was like, "How did we get here in a matter of like 5 minutes?" I'm like, I
Yeah.
don't get that. And this is like a day after Leah told me that, and I was just like, "Huh, maybe I do have that quality." I was just like, so like this is why I just enjoy podcasting so much. Is just because it is nice to podcast that way, right? I
Mm.
think so many people go in with like certain topics and everything, and they're not willing to like dive down. Like we talked about, dive down rabbit holes. Like I think
Yeah,
the best thing ever.
I
So
agree.
awesome. Well, welcome to the podcast. You are the
Thank you.
second guest episode on this one. Kind of want to give a little intro to who you are, what you do, anything about you. You know, kind of just like give away some of your life story, etc.
My life story. Oh boy. If I have the short and condensed version, it'd say like I am a coach slash researcher slash yogi slash artist. That would be my little condensed piece. Life story. Honestly, I feel like fitness has consumed a majority of my life, like a majority of my adult life, I guess. And recently, in the past like year and a half, I have more swung in a different direction, kind of blending my past with the future and where I think the world tends
Mhm.
to go naturally. So I think it's been a very natural evolution from this very like infantile fitness love story, and now it's like becoming more of a mature, integrated aspect of life in the world in general.
Yeah, because it's not like in you had a really smooth identity shift. It felt like
I'm
from
glad it
what I
felt like
saw.
a smooth identity shift.
It's really weird though because on social media, like it seemed like it was really smooth, like it was really subtle, but it wasn't. Right? Like it's
Mm,
like when you go through identity shifts, it's pretty hard for people because I'm going through mine right now, and I it's really hard, but people can see that energy kind of come out when it comes down to it, and that's where you see that shift be so like easy is because it goes from being like you weren't aligned to you are aligned, and people feel that like alignment like right away, you know?
yeah, it feels like a breath of fresh air because it's almost like you have these really tight shoes on and you're like, oh, I need to wear these shoes because I bought them and I put all this time and energy into them, like your old identity. And then it's like you finally like start undoing the laces like one at a time and you're like, oh, this actually feels really nice. And then you kind of throw the shoes away and you're like, oh my goodness, I can like breathe again. I can like, yeah, it's a weird metaphor now, but yeah, that's kind of what the identity shift feels like. It's like, what happens if I let some of this breathe, if I give it a little bit more space? And then usually when it's your first time, you tend to notice that, like, oh, none of this is actually right. All of this feels really, really weird.
You're like,
Yeah.
why am I so emotional? You're like, why am I so emotional? Why am I letting everything out? And it's just like, and it just comes in. It's just like, it's like a tsunami. It's not even like little
Yeah.
waves. It's just like, yeah, we're gonna get a big, huge like peak, and then we're gonna crash down really hard. It's like
Yeah.
you're gonna feel good one day, and you're gonna feel really shitty the next. Like that's how it is.
Yes. At least for me, it was very. As soon as I started, I'm not going to project it onto you, but as soon as I started, it was like everything felt worse, like nothing fit right. It's almost like if you had this big dish that you've been letting sit on your kitchen counter for a week, and then you start putting some water in it, and you scrub some things off, and it all floats up to the top. You're like, this is awful. I want nothing to do with this anymore. But you know, you can't leave the dish. You have to keep going. You know that you can't just leave it and let it go back to the way that it was.
Yeah.
So
What
yeah,
what was like the hardest part for you with that like identity shift, especially just like coming into your own, coming from being like such into competitive bodybuilding? into the now.
The biggest piece that I think people actually won't talk about is having to realize how much you actually have been lying to yourself and everyone else. Because I think that's a very loaded word, right? It's like, oh, I'm a liar. Like I literally was lying to myself about what I thought because it was masked by all of these pieces. Like, oh, there's fear, and I have to do it this way, or else like, what's gonna happen if I show up a different way? Like it doesn't align with the people that I think I should be, and then you start to realize like, oh crap, I don't believe in any of this, and I've been putting on this fake mask for everyone, like unconsciously. It's not like this malicious thing where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm lying so I can be the next big thing. But when you realize it, you're like, oh, I have a lot of work that needs to be done. I have a lot of mending to do with myself and also with other people, because that is broken trust, which is the best thing that can happen, but it also really sucks to admit it when it first happens.
Yeah, because you're kind of, I mean, you're putting the ego to the side, right? Like you're literally like killing the ego. And the biggest thing is that trust aspect. But I find that it's not even like, at least for me, it's not trust over other people. It's like trust within yourself. I think that's like the hardest part with people in this. And it's where like my thing is shifting. Yes, obviously I bodybuild, like I fucking love it. But like just like the way I've been going with things, like right, like we chatted about this just before we even started, right? Talked about like the podcast before. Like a lot of things were shifting away from being my non-authentic self. And I was like lying to myself, telling myself, oh no, it's all right, everything's good. But then it really wasn't. and you
Yeah.
and you kind of take that step back and you're like, fuck, I messed this up. And you're like, and you mess it up along the way, and like that's gonna happen because you're human. But I find at least it's like you broke the trust within yourself. And when
Mhm.
you do that, I feel like it's really hard to move to move the dial forward, like whatsoever. Like you're consistently going to be like stuck in the same spot until you actually address what you need to address.
Yeah. And what you said about trusting yourself versus like putting the trust out into others, like honestly, like the further you go, there really isn't a difference. It's like you can feel the energy of truth that like radiates out of you, and there isn't like a difference when you have other people around you versus if you're just by yourself. It just, you have this feeling where you know something isn't right, and
Hmm.
at some point you can't ignore it anymore because you've had it many times. You're like, ah, I know what you're up to.
Yeah. So what like sparked that? What sparked that being like, okay, now I need to address this? Like, was there one moment in time where you were like, I, my identity is shifting and I'm getting away from this, and like you kept feeding into that inauthentic self, and you kind of had to say like enough was enough? Like what was that enough is enough moment for you?
Hmm. That is actually really interesting. I've never had that question phrased that way. So you've heard the phrase like you have the two wolves inside you, and it's like which one you feed. My two wolves actually projected themselves out into the world. So I had one wolf that was very much telling me one thing and like reinforcing the old ego or the old identity structure that I had that was comfortable, that I was always trying to reinforce, and just like, oh, if I just, put this extra block on top of it, then it'll be perfect. And then it just keeps building. And then it was like at some point, this other wolf came into my life and was like, do you really think that way? And it was like, at first, it was like, of course I do, of course I do, of course I do. And everything gets tenser and tenser. And then just with more question asking, it's like, do you really think that way? And at some point, like, you realize you don't, because you run out of like ammunition to keep the story going. So for me it was like, oh, I actually like, I've been feeding the wrong one.
Yeah.
And having that project out and having to in that moment realize that I have been lying to the outside, that I have been mistruthful to myself, and this has literally projected itself into two different halves. And it's like I can either stay where I am and continue this lie that I've been living, this thing that I actually truthfully do not want, or I can step into this unknown, like, are you really sure? And just say like, no, I'm not. And as soon as I could have that moment where it's like I actually am unsure and allow the walls to crumble down, it was like you can see what's on the other side of the wall now. You can see that there is like so much more, and it is definitely frightening at first, especially when you're, like 21 and have just like
Yeah.
barely begun your whole life story, and then all of a sudden having to relearn and look at all the stuff that you didn't want to look at. And I would say that that was my turning point, is like having those two halves projected outwards and having to pick one.
Yeah, because I think people can feel that. right? This is where I
Mhm.
talked about like you can feel the energy from people, and you know when you're feeling that good energy and when things become truthful to who you are, because people will feel that positivity like radiate from you, but they'll also feel that you're holding yourself back.
Mhm.
And and I think it's really hard because like I've noticed it more because the group now I'm surrounded with also does a lot of this work. So it's like we all kind of understand how things very similarly kind of work with like energy and how we feel, and we're able to like kind of like vibrate off each other and like bounce off each other. Like you can feel that.
Mhm.
And like that at least for me was where it was, but I also had to deal with a lot of like childhood issues. But isn't it really weird how we're like well I'm 25, and it's just like you're just like, oh yeah, I'm having like a quarter life crisis already. You're like, fuck, I'm having like a crisis, right? And I think people will think that this is going to be like the end of the world.
Yeah.
At least that's how I thought about it. At least when my call to action came about, is it's literally going to feel like it's the end of the world. Like
And it
everything in
is
my
in some
everything
way.
in my life was shifting. Right, there was kind of like
Mhm.
that tower. We kind of chatted about it. You kind of have like a tower moment, um, and you're like, okay, these big shifts are happening. My life's getting a complete 180. Like in a matter of like 2 weeks, everything in my life completely shifted, and it's like, oh, this is really tough to handle. It's just like, so like that for me was the big like moment for me in terms of that you can, and you know when it's coming and it sucks like you talked about, right? But you think people need to continue just to dive. I know you tried about this actually the other day on your Instagram. You made a post about self trust and developing like a relationship with discomfort. Do you think this is
Mhm.
how we build a really good relationship with discomfort? Is actually like facing all those kind of traumas and such that we may have faced as like kids, or these things that led to where we even got to.
Yeah, so if, as far as the discomfort piece goes,
Yeah.
the only way to really like make a relationship with that is to create space.
Hmm.
And that's what we're going to kind of talk about a little bit further in the future here. But as far as that goes, when you're uncomfortable, you are uncomfortable. So you're saying my entire world right now, me, is discomfort, and there is no space for anything else. And then if you take a step back and you're like, okay, is if you're training in the gym, just because this is my wheelhouse, if you're training in the gym and you're like, I am uncomfortable, I am in pain, everything sucks, and you take a step back and you're like, okay, like if I'm doing bench press, do my toes suck right now? Like, are they horrible? Like, are they uncomfortable? And then you're like, oh, actually, like they're not uncomfortable, and you can kind of create space for what else is actually happening. So that's like the truth of the moment. It's like your whole being is not uncomfortable. The world is not uncomfortable. It's just this one situation that is now being like it taking up all of your awareness. So creating this relationship with discomfort is literally just creating space for it. And I would say also, depending on where you're at in your journey, if your discomfort is showing up as like numbness, for example, so you don't have any sensation of what's going on, it's just this perpetual emptiness, this perpetual abyss that you're
Yeah.
in, then actually like you need to do the opposite thing. It's like you need to create the sense of sensation in some way, finding where the discomfort actually is and allowing that to have more space. Because at some point you've shut down all of those doors, and now it's like your internal sight, your internal senses have been shut down so much that you can't even project them into the outside world because there's nothing there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's like, and I think a lot of people just shut themselves out in general from a lot of things. Like, at
Yeah.
least for me, the biggest thing is actually like, showing that emotion. Like, I've dealt with a ton of trauma in my life, and it's just like really hard to kind of show emotion. I swear I've done more work on myself in the last like 3 weeks, and I've cried more than ever. You know
Love
what I
that for you.
mean? Like it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to get there, but like it's because I'm releasing everything, right? And the body has to release things, and that's kind of like a side effect of that.
Yeah.
And I think, and this is where true change happens, right? We talk about it all the time with our athletes here. Like discomfort is where things really take off and really transform the person. Right? Because a lot of people will be like, "Oh, do I really want to do this?" Like, if you have to think about that, you probably should. Like, there are moments
Yeah.
of time where I'm like, I push my athletes to be like, they need to be a little bit scared to do what they're gonna do, and to become friends with that little scary feeling that they have, because it's just one, like you said, it's like one moment in time,
Hmm.
really. Like it's
And what
gonna,
you said is, yeah, what you said as far as like, oh, I don't really want to go here, and then saying like that's actually where you need to go. It's like you're already in a relationship with this thing that you don't want to be around. It's right. Like if you're saying I don't want this, then your relationship is to that thing is that you don't want this. So it still has you. You're still
yeah,
connected to it in some way. You're either attached to it or you're aversive and having resistance to it. So now it's like, okay, like my relationship is resistance. Why is that? And if you keep running away from it, it's like your shadow. It's just going to follow you all the time. You can't actually get rid of it until you like turn around, look at it, uh,
yeah, and you
change
face
it in
it.
some way.
Like that's
Yeah.
why I think even in like relationships, like there's two different there's a few different types, but there's like avoidant people and there's anxious attached people, right? Like I'm an
Yeah.
anxious attachment person. Like that's me. So it's like actually facing the anxiety of learning to like be by myself and not always have to be like caring for someone. That's been like a big thing that I've been working through. Um, and we've been working through like I have a ton of feminine energy, but I had a lot of wounded masculine energy
Mm.
with things. And people aren't going to want to talk about this, or they're going to want to think this is woo woo. But this is what we're having a combo on today.
This is why I'm here.
So,
This is my
um,
stuff.
but like it's actually from me not setting boundaries from
Mm.
things. And we chatted about that the other day, which is like a big. That's like I set a boundary the other day for like the first time ever, and it's been like a huge. It's been a huge thing because I've always moved boundaries for people, but for this time, like I fully like set a boundary, and like I'm keeping it, and like
Proud of you.
that's like me coming back into that actual masculine. So if you kind of want to get into that a little bit more,
Yeah.
or dive into those things, because people are going to be like, "What the hell is Anthony talking about being hitting his feminine energy, talking about being nurturing and caring, and the masculine having like boundaries made?" So I don't know if you want to dive into a little bit more of that and give people some insight.
Yeah, I would love to. So I have a background as a yoga instructor, and a lot of that is based around energy work. So the typical two ones that you will see is like the masculine and
Wait,
feminine.
can I interrupt before you get to that?
Yes.
How did you become a yoga instructor?
What do you mean? How did I become? I just like went to yoga class.
I was just like I'm. It's so interesting to see how people like go down different paths. Like, how did you get down the path of like yoga? Because it's
Yeah,
not
this is
something that
actually.
I knew because you bled so much into bodybuilding that
Mhm.
there wasn't like these like I didn't see these different paths for a long time. So like I want to know that path over how you got that point.
Yeah, and this actually goes really well with the masculine and feminine pieces. So, taking a big step back for me, for the past like year and a half, training has been a nightmare, to be honest. It is like being fully transparent. Like, I've been having like panic attacks, or I was having panic attacks in the gym in the middle of my training, and it was extremely uncomfortable for me to do any type of training so much that like I just wanted to skip the gym. Like I didn't even want to try. And it's like for someone that's been most of my life, that was a huge like crap. Like am I never going to be able to lift again? Am I never going to be able to compete again? Like what is my future now if this is my new reality? So that was my movement practice for so long was training. I didn't label it that way. And I noticed that I needed a different movement practice to start to feel safe in my body again so I could start to translate those skills into the gym at some point. So I started going to yoga and I did mostly these like yin classes. So that actually goes into the masculine and feminine because there's like the yin tissues, which are the more feminine, cooler tissues of the body. So your ligaments, your joints, connective tissue, bones, all of those pieces. And then your yang, masculine energy, is your muscles. So it's like for
Yeah.
me, as a bodybuilder and also you, we train our muscles very, very often. How often do we spend time on our training our connective tissue? Right.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like going into this yin practice and then seeing that creating a safe space for myself to feel into my body was allowing me to get to the gym more and actually show up in ways that I never even thought I could before. So this was kind of my safe space movement practice for a while, and it still is. But with that, it was a simultaneous healing of my feminine from the yin like internal perspective, being able to feel into my body, and then creating this space of the yoga studio was my masculine container for
Yeah.
it. So those are the two energies. So you have the feminine, which is everything that is happening. So like all of the arisings, everything in your field of consciousness, and then the masculine is the consciousness. So it's the one that sees everything. So with that, for me, I also had a lot of wounded masculine energy when I first started this. And I would say that I did it kind of backwards, where I tried to like fix my feminine first and then like realize like, oh crap, my masculine actually isn't strong enough to hold this now. So I kind of went down this rabbit hole of wanting to become a yoga instructor and create this space for people, because if I can hold it for myself and I can hold it for others, it's like that is the best masculine container I can have. And
Yeah,
with that, it also enhanced my coaching because I'm able to hold my
definitely.
girls better. So that's like the long-winded story of
Yeah.
that.
'Cause I think I find it with bodybuilding. Like, I mean, that's why, I mean, looking back on it, right? That's probably why I got into it in the first place, right? Like, I was talking about this before with a friend, and I was like, well, yeah, I'm missing a lot of masculine things. Well, the one thing that is lifting weights, and it gives you like structure and habits, and it puts you into a place where you're in control and you have that discipline, and that's like fully like a masculine energy type ideal. Um, so I think that's why a lot of people, whether you're male or female, get into it, because it's not just a male thing. Like, people think like it's masculine and feminine. Like, you have both in each person.
Yes.
What you display is what side your body prefers, but you need to have like a mix of both, to really kind of be in alignment with where you're at. So at least like I found personally that that's my space, right? And we should, and you just said that, right? Is like our space was bodybuilding, or is currently bodybuilding, at least for me. So it's just like,
Yeah.
but like that comes from a lot of those things that you are missing, usually from childhood, typically like that.
Yeah.
That I'm finding.
And and with that too, as far as the bodybuilding goes, I might overstep here, but I don't really care. So if we are it currently in the West in a very patriarchal society, not saying like this is like bad men, it's just more of the structure of everything. And with that, if we also have this wounded masculine energy almost everywhere you look in every single like compartment of Western culture, then of course we're all going to grow up with this wounded masculine energy. And with that, we're also going to keep projecting that to the outside until we realize that that is where we're at and why we have so many of these problems, these things that make us really uncomfortable and keep us from moving forward. So from what I noticed in bodybuilding, and I was a part of this,
Yep.
was that many of the wounded masculine pieces were showing up really, really strongly in the coaches, because
Hmm.
it's very easy to project that onto your athletes, because you can very much be the critiquer, you can be the tyrant, you can be the person that shames your athletes for not doing the right things. And it's like the more that I consumed this type of content and the more that I was trying to fit in with what the culture was, the more it was, like we talked about earlier, this act of self-betrayal. And I just noticed at some point, like, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. It doesn't need to be this way. It's causing more harm than good. And that change only happens from the inside. So that's what I guess I have been doing a lot for this past year, because I don't want to contribute to
Yeah.
more of that.
Yeah.
We have enough of that.
I was gonna say though, isn't that why some people actually prefer male coaches though to female coaches in terms of that thing, because of like they can embrace that pretty hard, and that
Yeah.
strictness, at least from like a competitive standpoint, can come over fairly well. And I think
Yes,
that's
and that's
that's kind of how you kind of have to look at it, at least from that perspective. I think from a lifestyle perspective, it's absolutely horrible if you think about that. I think from a competitive bodybuilding perspective, obviously, like, discipline and that stuff is needed. Like, but there's points of times where it could be lessened. But I think that's why, at least if just like thinking about it, that's why females or males tend to prefer to go down the male coach route in terms of the thing. But then like, there is that overstep, if there is.
yes, I would say the overstep is very prominent, because if we're talking about the masculine in general, like a
Mhm.
healthy masculine drive, like masculine is very purpose driven. So
Yes.
that is where you get this goal. It's very linear. It's like this is where I'm going.
Hmm.
And and you also have a healthy, which is I guess open to interpretation, level of competitiveness. Like
Yep.
it is like again with that purpose piece. And when you get into the more wounded and potentially unhealthy energies, then you have this over competitiveness. You have this need to win all the time, the need to be right all of the time. And with that, it's like it is a mini act of violence. Like that, there
Definitely.
is no way to say that. Like that, no one's gonna like that, and I don't care. But it's like if you win, then you have to make someone else lose, and it doesn't mean that like winning is bad. It's more just the mentality of going into it that way. So
Yeah.
if this is the masculine urge, which is to have this purpose, this drive, and then it oversteps, like you had mentioned, which we see very often in the bodybuilding space, then that's where we see these oversteps. We see the over competitiveness. We see this rivalry that is no longer human to human. It's like
I
we
wouldn't even.
take away the humanness of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it that too. I think I would just more. I think I would generalize it just as like jealousy in terms of
I like
things.
that.
Like that's more so. Like if you're thinking about it and you really, because if you really become uber competitive with this in this sport, and well, fitness in general will crush you if you decide to overstep that. And if you become jealous, you're just going to look at everyone and start comparing yourself to everyone. I think that's where it really starts to get a dangerous game here. Is when that overdrive goes to you over hyper fixating on little things, and which is good. I'm not going to say it's not bad, right? I think, hey, there are points of times if you want to be the best of the best and you want to get your pro card and you want to do those things, you're going to need to hyperfixate a little bit. I will say that.
Yeah.
That's just but that's like your goal perspective. It's like, what's your actual goal, right? But we
Yeah. And
definitely see, at least in this community, right? And I coach females and you coach females. Well, majority of them is more so. This issue more so tends towards females. Is they're consistently that comparison game of it, and I think that's where it starts to eat people alive. Is they
yeah.
start to look at other people's progressions instead of like dealing with their own, and that's where that jealousy really starts to come in.
Yeah. And the one thing that I'll just add to that before we like switch gears
Hmm.
is like those pieces, like you said, like hyper fixating on something is not an issue in it of itself. Like
Yep,
presenting that can be a very, very healthy
definitely.
avenue for you, or it can be very unhealthy. It's the energy which you bring to it, if that makes
Yep.
sense. So it's
Hmm.
the underlying piece. So it's like these actions, I'm not saying that bodybuilding is bad. I'm not saying that like the coaching in itself is bad. It's more what energy is coming out of it and why is that the driver, right?
Yeah.
So it's like always asking these pieces. And with the jealousy component, this switches us to this more feminine energy, this more wounded feminine energy, usually coming from like a sisterhood wound, if we want to really get woo woo with it. Thinking that, jealousy is thinking that someone has something that you covet, that you can't have. Their having of this thing, it means that you cannot have it. Instead of this being a sign that you can actually, that it's abundant, that it's everywhere, that this is coming to you, affirming that
Hmm.
this is positive. And when we think of the sisterhood wound, and again, this like patriarchal society that we're in, this is very common because we, as women, or females, we are smaller and tend to rely on men for certain pieces, even if it's not exactly that way anymore. If we look back into like the witch hunts, for example, it's like, women were being burned for being different, all of these pieces. And there were still women in those crowds saying, burn them. It's like, I'm not going to do this. Like, I'm on your side. Right. So that's
Yeah.
where this like jealousy, I need to compete with women because if it's like, if I can put her down, at least it won't be me. So it's like this protective mechanism,
Okay.
which is understandable, but also not true to who you are.
Yeah. And I think this is where it also, guys, right, is because it's your journey, right? Like I
Yeah.
think a lot of people forget that it's like your narrative that you're following, like it's not someone else's. And I think that's where that comes in, is when you start to lose or something like that at something, it turns into, oh, you must be following someone else's narrative or someone else's,
Mm,
when you're not actually taking anything away from what just happened whatsoever,
yeah.
right? Because I think a lot of people lose, and the first thing they do is they blame something instead of like looking at the lessons that they could have learned, okay, or instead of looking within to see where could they have done better. Because I think that's what you're supposed to do, right? Is you're supposed to always, at least I think like big thing I've always said is compare yourself to who you were like yesterday, not to who someone else is today, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest thing with fitness in general. And that's what I tell a lot of my athletes is I'm like, oh, don't look at what some of my athletes are. I was like, the last thing you want to do is compare some of my athletes. I was like, I have a few people that are genetic elites, and I was like, I have a few people that aren't. I was like, you just have to stick to you. They're like, because people get frustrated about me posting. I've actually gotten this before. Like me posting athletes' results. Like I've gotten this a few times from some people. They're like, well, why can't I get that? I was like,
Mm.
because you're on a completely separate journey than they are. I
Yeah.
was like, you don't know how adherent this person is compared to you. You don't know what this person's doing compared to you. I was like, you don't know what their inside health is like compared to you. I'm like, that's why you can never compare things because everyone else has something different going on. And it's just like, you can't really control those. And especially genetics. I gotta say, the
Yeah.
one thing that you can't control is genetics. I have shitty genetics. Like, right? So I'm just like, whatever. I'm like, I'm just gonna have fun. I'm just gonna get strong and big and whatever.
Yeah. And with that too, it's like what you just said about someone else's story. It's like, are you, which story are you telling a story or are you choosing someone else's and trying to pass that off as your own?
Hmm.
Because that's really like, at least that's what I was doing. I think with these identity pieces that we're talking about, it's like we model after the people that we surround ourselves with. Like you've heard that quote, like we're the average of the 5 people that we spend the most time with. And it's like, okay, so are you choosing your own story? Are you telling your own story as it's actually unfolding? Or are you just, following along with the chapters of someone else's book that's been written that isn't for you?
Yeah. And that's kind of why and that's kind of, I'm guessing, why training wasn't fun for you. Right?
Yeah, for me, it was having my I'm being very cautious with my words. Uh, Having my internal wounded masculine of what things needed to be for me to fit this certain mold projected to the outside to an extent that I could no longer handle.
Yeah.
And that is no one's fault but my own. It more just bubbled up to a point that I couldn't hold it anymore and something needed to change. It's like I either was going to be one of those people that burnt out of bodybuilding forever, which we see often. And I used to judge those people. That used to be who I was. I would be
Yeah.
like, oh, like they weren't tough enough. They weren't this, they got into it for the wrong reasons. Just, all of these pieces. And then when it started to happen to me, it's like, oh, well, I'm not like this. This isn't me. Like, don't misunderstand me. And it's like, oh, I'm actually misunderstanding everyone else. So it was either burn out completely, become this thing that I was adamant that I wasn't, or it was find a new path, find a new way to go, a new way of looking at it. And honestly, like, I was completely alone in that because nobody at the time was thinking or doing any of the things that I was doing. And as I was having this identity shift, I actually had like a decent amount of pushback. I had random like decent coaches that were like reposting my stuff saying like, this is what's wrong with bodybuilding. It's like, is it?
Yeah.
Is it really?
Now, now you could have avoided it.
Mm.
You could have avoided it. Why didn't you?
This comes down to this truth component, right? And if I had avoided it and I had either stifled my own voice, which is something that I actually struggled with for quite a while. It was like I didn't know who my own voice was, and it was like there was always this lag between what I was saying because I was thinking about whose voice to parrot, who was I supposed to be to answer this question. So finding my own voice and then going to a place where I withheld it again or changed the narrative to something that I didn't truly believe was not in the cards for me. And I also knew that even if it wasn't right now, that there had to be people who felt the same way that I did and were also being misunderstood the way that I was misunderstanding other people. So it felt too important to me, I guess, to lay low and say nothing. It felt like it needed to be said. And it's okay if it's me. I can accept the criticism. I can accept it now. At the time it was a little difficult, but now it doesn't bother me because like even like a couple weeks ago I had almost 40 women who were like, yeah, I want to learn about this, I need help with this, all of them saying like, I do struggle with my inner critic, I do struggle with shaming myself, I do feel like I don't have a place in fitness right now. All of these pieces, like this is not just a me thing. This is
Yeah.
not just like a woo woo piece. It
Yeah.
is systemic whether people want to believe it or not. And it's like the conversations in my DMs and everything else, it's too important to not say anything anymore
Now,
to me.
do you think it was a struggle of losing your voice is due to just like educational background and things like that too, though, where you are at least like the way I kind of think about it, like you're so taught to kind of think one way instead of actually like having your own thought. So you think it's more so the way that we're actually raised as kids that also plays that
Yeah,
factor into it? Because
absolutely.
that's how I'm finding it. Is more so I feel like I would always say something that someone else would want me to say. Right? And
Yeah.
I think that's where a lot of people get with anything they do, right? And it's just like, I'm going to I'm going to do this, or I'm going to go to school because this is what X person wants to do, or I'm going to go do this for my full-time job because this is what X thinks I should do. And I probably should do like like you think you should do something, but it may not feel like it's right for you in terms of things.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. For me, it was like something that I learned growing up just to take the route that everyone else is taking. So, that's like not having my own voice, just going with the flow of what everything else was.
Mm-hmm.
And in this specific situation, it's like, oh, if all of the bodybuilding coaches are saying this, then like I need to say it or else I'm one of the bad ones and I don't want that. I'm not one of the bad ones. So, a lot of this if you've noticed, it's like the identity shift is like realizing that you are who you don't want to be because you are everything. You're both we're duality based humans. You can't be only half. You can't be half a coin. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So it's coming to terms that like these pieces that you say that you're not and that you've been holding on to and rejecting the other pieces, like noticing that you are in relationship with those things and bringing harmony to the two and acceptance.
And I think we say that we're not because we're scared of what other people are going to think. Like
Bingo. Yeah.
that's how I see it. Is you're so frightened to actually step out of the box for once that you're just like you kind of tip your toe in the water. Like it's when like you're going there, you're like, it's freezing. You just got to fucking dive into it. Like that's what I tell people. Now I'm just like, if you're gonna do it and you're gonna do it your own way, like you just got to send it like yourself. Like there's no other way to go about it because if you just try to tiptoe in there, you're you're gonna talk your way out of whatever you were gonna do.
Yeah, I would say that. And also having people who actually want to hear the real you around is really helpful with that. Because if you're doing it with the people that maybe taught you these things, like if you're still in like a certain family situation or around your old group of friends and like that's where you picked up on these habits, like they don't expect that from you. And you're probably going to get more pushback than you're ready for when you're first building up these skills. So like if that means like changing who you're communicating with, if it means like finding a different group, even if it's online for now, just finding people who actually want to hear what you have to say. And even if they don't agree, they can just hold space for it and you can just slowly start. So like that would be like the putting the toes in one at a time, but also like not giving up on it because it is one of the most important things that you can do because if you don't have your own voice, if you don't have your own thoughts, then like who are you?
Yeah. What was the first time? When was the first time you found your voice?
So I'll just kind of dive into it. So it was like one of my first little excursions into the unknown with certain aids. Um,
Everything is available. So whatever you want to discuss, we're able to discuss.
yeah, so certain aids. I noticed that my whole trip was basically around not being able to speak. Like I literally lost my voice for 6 hours. It was like no matter like what I wanted to say, like even if I wanted to ask for help, because it's like when you don't have
Mhm.
your voice, like you're scared, right? Like or at least I was scared. I was frightened. I was like, oh my gosh, like I can never talk again. It's like even if I want to like ask for help, I can't. And it's like, okay, well, like why is this? It's like, oh, because like you have never actually had a real voice before in your whole life. Sit with that.
Just
Sit with that.
like bam, just like here you go on a silver platter right in front of you.
Yeah, and then every time after that, since I wanted to speak and something was going to come out of me that wasn't authentic, there would be the same feeling in my throat that I couldn't speak. So it's almost like it was like a new learned pattern for me that like when you're going to betray yourself, you're going to say something that's not true or isn't towards your highest good, whatever you want to say about that, it's like you won't be able to say it. This is like the this is the new normal. So that's like a very extreme version. I don't think that's very applicable to everybody, but for
Yeah.
me that was the biggest piece. It was the biggest eye opener that I have ever had.
Oh, you'll feel it. You'll feel your heart start to race. Like
Mm-hmm.
when you well actually you'll feel it in two sectors. I will say you either feel your heart race because you're about to tell the truth and you're about to hurt someone's feelings, or two, you're about to say something that isn't true to who you are. At least that's how I found it. A lot of mine as
Yeah.
of late has come from having to actually express things out and tell the full truth with things, um, and not more so saying the right thing. It's just like actually letting things go. Um, Now I do want to dive into your yoga and everything like that. Like, how do these all play in like piecing together all of this, like meditation and everything? Because there's a whole lot of things with meditation, manifestation, breathing, different types of breathing, etc., to connect to like all different types of energy flows, and such. So I kind of want you to dive into how some of these like modalities of or strategies kind of help with being able to connect to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So when people think of yoga, they think of, like a bunch of white women probably in the suburbs somewhere doing like downward facing dog. And that is certainly a part, a very, very, very small part of yoga. So if we have the eight limbs, which people have probably heard of, yoga that we think of in the West is asana practice. So that is the movement practice, but that is only one of the eight limbs. So that is only one of the pieces. And the purpose of asana, the purpose of a movement practice is to basically give your body that outlet so you can kind of let out some of these energetic pieces. And then once you go to sit down in your meditation, you are calmer in mind and body. So
Yeah.
you're able to sit for longer periods of time. You're able to feel a bit more comfortable in the seated posture or whatever meditation posture you're taking.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how those two blend together.
Okay.
Then with the breath work that you're talking about, we were talking about energy as well. So in yoga, that is called prana. So it is the universal life force. Like when we think of energy in the West, we usually have this very physics-based thing. It's like, oh, energy is the ability to do work, which
Yeah.
is very, very interesting, like looking back on now. But so prana is this universal energy that is everywhere. You cannot escape it. And when we are breathing in prana, we are breathing in this universal life force. And when we're breathing
Yep.
out, we are breathing it back. So we're giving back that energy. And with these different breathing practices, it's there are a lot of different ones. So you have different effects of the body. But the main focus of it is basically to give the mind something to do because the mind always wants to think. And even when you do start these breathing practices, your mind still wants to say, I don't like this. I want to do
Mhm.
something else. This is boring. This is really uncomfortable. So it kind of gives your mind something to do, something to play
Mhm.
with. And if that's not really your jam, there's also like mantras. So those are just the things that you usually hear people speaking of. So if you wanted to do like the chakra based ones, you can have like Ram, Lam, hum, yam, all of these pieces, and just like repeat those over and over again to again quiet the mind, which is the purpose of meditation. And kind of when we
Yep.
blend all of these pieces together, then we can get to these higher limbs of yoga where you have samadhi and you have this enlightenment experience where you are one with the universe. So I'm not sure if that helped.
Yeah, I was gonna actually ask you about this because I'm really curious. Do you think people struggle with meditation because they don't actually know how to calm the mind? I'm like,
Yes, and honest
what do you think people struggle with most when it comes down to that? Because a lot of people think it's like they think meditation is woo, but I know all my like at least me and all my friends, we meditate like every single like people who put it into practice do it almost daily for a good length of time. I think like the other day I had like off from work on Monday and I literally sat and did like an hour meditation. I was in a trance. Like that was
yeah.
wild. I was like I never been able to do more than 10 minutes typically, and I did like an hour and I was like, where the fuck am I? Like I woke up and I was like,
Yeah.
I have no clue. So kind of want to get your thing over like people actually being able to quiet that mind and being able to like sit with themselves. Because I think that's with all the energy states and getting into these energy states and getting into everything is like you have to be with yourself and just
Mhm.
and that's it. Like no one else. Like it's just you.
Yeah. So that is a very, very common piece. And that also is something that I personally like have struggled with. So it's kind of broadening what meditation is and what the
Mhm.
actual like purpose of it is. So if like the purpose of meditation is for you to find where you're clinging, where you still kind of like have sticky fingers to these pieces, whether that's like I don't want this, so I'm resisting this piece that is a part of life and I need to just sit with and be uncomfortable with, or like I'm clinging towards this and I need to have it, which also creates this tension in the body. So it's like you can do that through your daily life. But if you're not used to it, having a seated practice, having a yoga practice where you have the sole purpose of thinking and noticing what the judgments in different pieces are that pop up. So it's like if you're in a certain pose and you're like, this sucks, like it hurts, like I don't like any of these pieces, then bingo, you found something that you can work with. Amazing. And so if like sitting isn't your jam just yet, that's perfectly fine. There are walking meditations you can have you heard of haikus? Do you know haikus?
Yeah, man, it's been like since like elementary school, but
Yeah, so
yeah.
they're yeah, they're like the little poems that are literally like meant to follow the train of thought. So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can
yeah.
have like haikus as a method of meditation. For me, my easiest way to meditate is to sing, which people
Yeah.
usually don't think about. So it's really like finding what brings you into this state where you can be inward and you can kind of watch what is coming up without judgment, but also with curiosity. So I do think that having, especially in like this Western society that we're in, just having a place where you can sit and not have anything to do and you can just be, which many of us have a difficult time with, which is understandable, than any of these other practices that just give you a little sliver that you can look into. And even if you want to
Mhm.
carry that throughout your day, have that be your intention. That's also
Mhm.
perfectly fine. It's really just like meeting yourself where you're at. And for me, like I only recently started to be able to sit for like 30 minutes for meditation. And even then it's still difficult. But
It's
that's
crazy
my
though.
personal path.
Crazy though,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
when you actually sit there, you're like 30 minutes flew by because you're so. What I found is you just get so into old old memories. You start to dig pretty deep, and you're just like, where did that come from? You're
Hmm.
That's like how I feel, and I think it's really important for people to find like a flow state for a lot of things. Like that's why I consider that quiet mind that you were talking about, or something that helps people like through that be present. Like for me, it's basically just like moving my body. Like for some
Hmm.
people, or even one thing that helps, which I've talked to my athletes about, is go on a walk and actually don't listen to anything. Like don't even wear headphones. Just actually go and like listen to nature, and you'll
Hmm.
find yourself. You're like, oh, it's a lot more relaxing than I thought it would without like music in my ears or a podcast in my ears. I think a lot of people always try to like tune that out, right? Like those are moments where it'd be perfect to sit with yourself and actually just let things flow through. And I also don't think people let their thoughts flow through either.
Yeah.
Like that's what meditation and everything has taught me is okay, kind of comes in, I acknowledge it, and then it moves. And you're like, okay. But did you have to acknowledge it?
Hmm.
Or else it's just like some people just get so stuck on it. And they're like, okay, now I've lost my breath, and now I'm just gonna go down this rabbit hole. And it's like anxiety, 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 and you're not actually getting from it. And I think that's why we probably as coaches probably place things in the morning and the night, right? Because it's
Mm.
optimal time for people to actually like be alone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I
I
love
did.
you step into that.
That's where I noticed it. So my flow is like dancing. That's my shit.
I
I'll
love
sit
that for
here in the
you.
room. I have like an RGB light. I'll throw that up and I'll like pose at night or something.
I
I'll like
love that for you.
flow at night. Like that's what I do. Um, that's why my nickname when I worked at a bar was called Hands because I'd be jazz hands because I would just dance all night and then I kick people out. Yeah, I'd literally do that.
Amazing.
Then I kick like a 6 foot dude out. Yeah,
I
that's
love
how
that
it
for you.
is. And I think
And
it's just
and
yeah. You go.
the one piece I wanted to add to the
Hmm.
meditation portion that you just mentioned, like when you go down these rabbit holes, I think the first thing, like when you come back to yourself, is to like shame yourself. So like, fuck, I wasn't
Yep.
supposed to do that. Like I'm supposed to be watching my thoughts. I'm not supposed to be identified with them. Like,
Mhm.
no. It's like, no, this was actually a perfect meditation practice. Like you came back, like you obviously have to at some point. You can't just sit there forever. You can't just sit lost in your mind
Yeah.
forever. At some point you will come
We wish we
back.
could. We wish we could sit there forever and just like lose ourselves in it, but no, we got to be a functional human.
Yeah, so when people first start, I think they get really frustrated because they get lost and they're like, crap, like this is not what I did it wrong. And it's like, you can't do it wrong. You're here. You've done the hardest part, and that is sitting down and like committing to this practice, even if it's for 5 minutes and even if you get lost the whole time. It's just the intention behind it. Nobody expects you to be perfect, especially when you start out.
Now, this is probably going to be a big question. It's kind of a little loaded in a way. It's vague.
Okay.
Where should people even start with learning how to dive into those wounds or things like that? Because I've had guidance. You probably
Hmm.
had guidance from people, like in a way. That's
Yeah.
what I recommend when it comes down to things is find someone you trust really, really heavily with things. But where should people like start to kind of like, I guess like improve? I wouldn't say fully like fix, but improve those like wounds and those and finding those sides to themselves and finding like a balanced energy state.
Yeah, and I think my answer will be very ambiguous, but it's starting exactly where you are. Like if someone's listening to this podcast right now and they think that we're just like full of it and they want nothing to do with it, perfect. Perfect. Amazing. This is not for you right now, and that is absolutely okay. It's not going to be for everybody. But if someone is resonating with this and they're like, "Oh, I like," and it shifts something in them, it wakes something up, and they want to go further into that, that's where they go. And look, as far as what you said is finding someone to trust that you want to give your internal pieces to for this. A quote of mine that I like is like, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So like if you're meant to have a teacher, a guru, a mentor, any of these pieces, then like, if you're ready for one, they will appear and you will link up and it'll be what you need in that moment, even if it is helpful, and even if you think it's not helpful, like that is exactly where you're supposed to go. So if something is resonating with the person listening to this right now, then that's exactly where you need to go. It doesn't need to be my path, it doesn't need to be your path, it doesn't need to be anyone else's path. Again, that's like telling your own story instead of choosing it because someone else has already laid the path and it seems easier. So it's truly just feeling where you are right now and then taking that little step forward that feels right for you, that feels truly right for you. And like you'll notice if it doesn't. Like you'll notice again, like the way I've noticed my throat closing up, the way that like you notice you need to set a boundary. It's like these pieces make themselves clear once we start to listen.
Yeah. And I think I think it's also just be open to it. I think
Yeah.
so many people are closed off to it. Like we talked about, everyone's going to think this is like woo woo, but this is why I'm having these conversations in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Because I want to discuss what people won't discuss. And this is
Yeah.
something that I just find really interesting when it comes down to it, just because I'm in it right now. Like I'm experiencing it right now. So it's like, this is why I wanted to have this conversation when I had it, because I'm like, okay, I can actually apply this to what I'm
Yeah.
doing
And
right now.
the fun
And
thing is
yeah.
fun thing is that you're always going to be going through it. It's
Oh
not like
yeah.
an ending piece. It's always ebbs and flows. That's life in general. And the other thing too is it's like when we say like, okay, like be open. Like if you're not currently open, that's also where you are. Like if you're
Mhm.
currently closed off to these pieces, like and you force yourself to open, that's not opening. That is the
Yeah.
opposite of what we
But I
want.
feel,
This
but
will
then again, though, I feel like you do need that little like we both had. You need that little nudge though to open it. Like you know what I mean? Like there has to be that key. Like how I talk about it is, at least what happened with me. There's like a key that has the lock. The lock is there, but for some reason it's jimmying it up, and
Yeah.
it's just waiting for you to be ready. And when like you tell yourself you're ready, it will unlock. Like so, you have the right key in the right lock. It's just not working, or you did something stupid. So I'm just like, that's how I think about it. But I feel like you need a catalyst for it to open. Like it's not just gonna be like, hey, I'm ready. Like there's not. I feel like there's
It
not
might
just.
be.
There might be, but I feel like for us at least there was a catalyst that really caused it to really happen and
Yeah.
really occur. Um, and I think that's important to also take in those moments, like those big shifts in what's happening to you. Like those are the times when you need to dive into it because it's gonna help. That's like you becoming a new you, or well, not even a new you. You actually allowing yourself to be you in all reality. Whereas before you weren't. So I think it definitely is. It's a hard place. That's why I asked that question because it's just like, where do we even start? Like, because people are
Yeah.
gonna ask that. Because I knew people are gonna ask that when it comes down to it. They're gonna be like, well, how do I even start this? And it's like, you'll know.
Yeah.
You'll know if you're open to it. You have to be open to it 100%. You can't with this. I feel like you cannot commit to it unless you're ready. Like unless you're 100% all in on it. Like, and that's at least how I took it because I had to be all in on
Yeah.
it, fully make it work.
And the path, it's not a path, right?
Nope.
Like it's like there's nothing that's like laid out for you and you have to follow this thing. It's like you're blazing your own. And there's like this really cool scene in Alice in Wonderland when she finally finds the path and then this little like dog comes and like sweeps it off and she has to start all over again. So it's like when you think you have the path, you probably don't. So it's just it's play. It's not like this serious thing. Like I know we talk about it and it's like it's shadow work and like I need to like get past these wounds and these things. And it's like this is fun. Like have
Oh,
fun with
see,
it.
see, this is where I'm gonna blast some people, because it's like people think like this work is gonna be so hard, and because you're digging up a lot of shit. Um, but I'm finding it fun
Yeah.
because it's like it's if you do it right, it's relieving. Like it really is. At least in my, it's gonna be tough. There's gonna be days where it does suck, but there's gonna be days when you get such a good like read off things that you're like, okay, you're like things are heading in the right path, and you kind of get
Yeah.
like these, like I said, you get these peaks, and then the valleys. Like I'm like, if you're open to it, you're gonna get some heavy peaks in the beginning and some heavy valleys, and then it starts to like level out a little bit more, and you're like you're starting to figure it out. But it's how you take it, and I think that's how life is in general, right? It's how you look at
Yeah.
everything. Um, that's how you should be. So if you look at it in the right mindset, you're gonna get the right things from it. So all right. Well, I do want to ask you a few questions before you leave. We have
Okay.
same three questions to everyone. What should people take away from this episode?
You are exactly where you need to be right now.
Awesome. That's a good one. That's a really good one. All right. What three books or podcasts should everyone either read or listen to?
For everyone, oh boy, if you liked this podcast,
For
then
anything. Honestly, like you're like, if anyone should read anything or listen to anything, what should they do? What should they read or listen to?
oh, I will say one of the most transformational books for me was Women Who Run with Wolves, even if you are male and you identify with more masculine energy. Amazing, amazing, amazing book. Oh, I've read so many. Yamas and Yamas, if you like yoga, or if you're even interested in fundamental do's and don'ts, which I don't like those phrasings. And the last one, oh, I don't know if I have a last one. I liked this Chakras and the Archetypes book. That one was also really, really enlightening and hit me right where I needed to at the right times.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Last one, probably going to be the easiest question you answer all day. Where can people find you? Your 15 seconds of fame. Shout
15
out anything that
seconds.
you want to shout out, anything you want to shout out or find, and I'll link it all down below in the show notes.
Yeah. It's just Instagram. It's just at Alexa Rukstela. And I don't really do the website stuff. And if you like this kind of work and you feel like you need a little bit more guidance, I have a free mindfulness journal for you, which is very fitness oriented if you're in that space.
Awesome. Well, if you guys did enjoy this episode, as always, go subscribe to the podcast, go subscribe to the YouTube, leave us a 5-star rating and review, go follow Alexa on her Instagram, go use code SPADA at Morphogen Nutrition for 10% off all products. Go support your boy, go follow me on Instagram too as well, and also tag us on Instagram. If you guys enjoyed the episode, share that you guys are listening, tag both of us. We will definitely repost on our stories. So we hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the Noble Pursuit podcast, and I hope you have a great day.
Bye.
Here's my stop.